talking in particular about nitrogen and phosphate impacts. And then we'll briefly go over some examples of where it's becoming a problem and what kind of issues it's causing, and then a brief overview of how different local authorities are responding and potential options for mitigation and what kind of assistance we can provide going forwards. Just briefly, in terms of what kind of nutrient neutrality is, the principal nutrients that this issue is looking at the moment are nitrogen and phosphorus, which are important nutrients for plant growth. However, where you have higher or elevated levels of either of these nutrients, you can end up with undesirable conditions in aquatic habitats such as eutrophication. In particular, on the south coast, we're seeing a trend for dense algal growth in many of the harbours and European sites there. One of the main diffuse sources of both of these nutrients is runoff from agriculture, in particular kind of application of artificial fertilisers, but also application of slurry and things like that. And one of the issues we have is that those agricultural sources have been kind of taking place over a long period of time, and quite often it takes a long time for the nutrients to actually enter groundwater and rivers and then reach the European sites. So that adds another layer of complexity. But on top of agricultural and other industrial sources, there's urban sources, one of the principal ones being wastewater treatment works. And part of the background to this kind of modern issue was a report that was published by Partnership South Hampshire in 2018, which was raising questions over whether or not there was sufficient wastewater capacity in a lot of the southern water treatment works along the south coast. Coupled with this was kind of further assessment suggesting that many of the coastal European sites were in poor or unfavourable condition, principally because of elevated nutrient levels. So the idea is that nutrient neutrality basically involves some kind of offsetting to ensure that the outcome of a development is that there's no net increase in nutrient outputs post-development. And because this relates to impacts on European sites, as I'll go on to, any mitigation or offsetting needs to be secured in perpetuity, which in legal terms is going to be either 80 or 125 years, but in practical sense, for example, some of the case studies we'll go on to where we've got third-party bodies like a wildlife trust dealing with management, they're going to be looking at it as a permanent solution. So just a brief overview of the Solent River catchment, which is one of the main areas where this is becoming an issue and the main area that I've been involved in. This map shows the current condition status of many of the European sites in the Solent, and it just kind of demonstrates how small the areas that are in favourable condition are. Like SSSIs, these European sites, which are either special areas of conservation or special protection areas, there is a presumption that these should be in favourable condition and should be managed to achieve favourable condition. And when we carry out habitats regulations assessments, which I'll explain in a moment, they have to be carried out on the assumption that the baseline should be a favourable condition. And part of the problem we have is that at the moment we're unable to demonstrate that these sites are in that condition, and we're unable to see any progress towards them achieving favourable condition because of these continued elevated levels of nitrogen. It's principally nitrogen which is an issue in the Solent kind of catchment. So just a brief overview of the legislative side of it. This is the main piece of legislation which governs assessment and impacts on European sites, the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017. And the principal regulation is this one, Regulation 63, which states that the competent authority, before deciding to undertake or give any consent, permission or other authorisation for a plan or project, which is likely to have a significant effect on a European site, has to carry out an appropriate assessment, and this is what we call a habitats regulations assessment. And in terms of the nutrient and nitrogen phosphate issues, we're now in a position where Natural England, who are the statutory nature conservation organisation and who review habitats regulations assessments carried out by competent authorities, are of the view that a net increase in nitrogen or phosphorus is likely to have a significant effect on either marine or aquatic European sites that are connected. We've also been affected by some recent case law in the European courts, in particular this one, which I won't try and pronounce, but we tend to refer to as the Dutch nitrogen cases. This was related predominantly to agricultural applications in the Netherlands, but there were these main kind of 4 points which have affected things elsewhere in Europe as well. In particular, it emphasised the need to consider nitrogen pollution as part of the appropriate assessment process, and also raised the point that all sources of nitrogen have to be considered in combination. The judge also stated that in order to make that assessment, the level of nitrogen which is harmful has to be known. If there's no positive effect, it has to therefore be assumed to be negative. And the difficulty this gives us in many situations in the UK, such as the Solent, is that we simply don't know what level of nitrogen causes a harmful effect. The number of sources of nitrogen are considerable, and carrying out a detailed in-combination assessment just isn't practical, which is why Natural England have recommended going down the route of nitrogen neutrality, because if you're able to demonstrate through your appropriate assessment that there will be a neutral or a net reduction in nitrogen, it effectively enables you to sidestep this really complicated piece of assessment. So from that sense, it's quite a sensible way of looking at it. The trouble is we'll go on to, it becomes quite challenging to do so. So in terms of the current approach to carrying out assessments, Natural England originally issued guidance in June 2019 on achieving nitrogen neutrality. This has since been updated 2 or 3 more times, with the June 2020 version being the most up-to-date. And this sets out a method for calculating the nitrogen load from new development, which then must be offset. And that amount of nitrogen is based on the volume of wastewater generated by a development, based on the number of dwellings and an assumed 110 litres per day water usage figure, and the permit levels for the discharge of nitrogen at receiving wastewater treatment works. And there's a comparable set of calculations to be done for phosphorus as well, that just use different figures for the actual output levels of the wastewater treatment works. And as I mentioned, the requirement is for mitigation or offsetting to be secured in perpetuity, which is typically 80 to 125 years. Since that original guidance, there have been a few tweaks which have allowed a slight reduction in the outputs from wastewater treatment works to take account of background nitrogen levels that already exist in river and groundwater, which we actually did some technical work to try and test about a year or so ago. And the principle, as I mentioned, is that unless you can demonstrate that either your development is neutral or there's a reduction, there will be a requirement for mitigation or offsetting. There's a number of challenges in this methodology, however, probably the main one being the fact that most wastewater treatment works don't have a discharge consent level for nitrogen, because up until recently it hasn't been considered a key chemical and nutrient that needs to be controlled. There's often treatment consent levels for phosphorus, and there's often ones for other chemicals, heavy metals, that kind of thing. And a lot of treatment works just aren't designed to deal with nitrogen removal, which means that we have to use a default value of 27 milligrams per litre when we carry out these calculations, which is approximately 3 times the discharge consent level at the major southern water treatment works on the south coast at Peel Common and Budds Farm. And that means that for a lot of sites, we're using much higher figures, or we have to use much higher figures in terms of the actual amount of nitrogen that's being generated. And then obviously, consequently, that means that the amount of mitigation or offsetting that's required is much higher as well. So in terms of who this is affecting, the biggest impact is on developers, because as anyone who's been involved in this issue at all on any of their sites so far will be aware of, it's adding significant delays and costs to the planning application process. I am still involved in projects which have been delayed for kind of 18 months or even more now, because it's not been possible to agree an offsetting solution for those sites, or where we've had difficulties dealing with particularly awkward planning authorities or officers. And the costs, as we'll move on to in the next slide, are quite significant as well, particularly for developments where those costs haven't been allowed for because submissions were made before this became a real issue early last year. But there's also concerns, I think, for others, in particular local authorities. We're seeing large impacts on the delivery of the 5-year housing land supply and meeting government targets where development can't be delivered because of this issue. And consequently, there's going to be a knock-on effect on local economy and delivery of infrastructure, because a lot of that relies on contributions that are delivered through development. And there's a particular impact on certain types of sites as well. So brownfield sites or other sites that have got no agricultural use, because when we carry out the initial nitrogen assessment, the main saving in nitrogen in the system which development can achieve is by carrying out development on intensive agricultural land, where you're effectively removing the use of fertilizers and other diffuse sources of nitrogen and replacing it with new development, which a lot of the time has a lower nitrogen output. So those that aren't in agricultural use are a particular challenge. Sites which are grazed, which has a fairly low intensity agriculture. As I mentioned, sites which discharge to wastewater treatment works which don't have a permit level for total nitrogen or total phosphorus, which is principally those along the River Test and the River Itchen. This table sets out where the Hampshire authorities were as of October last year, and things haven't moved on a great deal since then. As this shows you, kind of most authorities don't really have a solution themselves in terms of delivering mitigation or offsetting for nitrogen impacts. Several authorities were and are still relying on the use of a grampian condition to enable them to issue a permission. The idea being that they're able to conclude their appropriate assessment by saying that there can't be an adverse impact on a European site because a development can't actually proceed until it's discharged that grampian condition. However, there's been a large number of appeal decisions where planning inspectors, particularly in Fareham, have determined that that is not an appropriate form of mitigation. So it's certainly something that I wouldn't recommend, because I don't think it's defensible in the event that you'd end up in a challenge situation. And I know many developers aren't keen on it, because effectively you are having to conclude your planning permission quite often, conclude on the purchase of a site with no clear indication as to when the site's actually going to be deliverable. However, there are a couple of authorities which have managed to bring together some kind of a solution. So EC Borough Council, for example, are now implementing a mitigation scheme using offsetting agricultural land, which they have control of, which will be approximately £4,500 per dwelling. However, at the moment, that's fairly limited in scope, although I know they are looking to acquire more land in order to expand that. Fareham and Havant Borough Councils are buying into a scheme which will be delivered by Hampshire and Isle of Wildlife Trust, which is approximately £2,000 per kilogram, and that uses an offsetting site on the Isle of Wight, which is agricultural land which will be allowed to rewild. Portsmouth Council have developed a scheme where they are carrying out, or they will carry out, retrofitting to existing council properties in order to increase the water efficiency there, and then that reduction in nitrogen from those units can be used to offset new development, which is it's a ratio of approximately 2.5 existing properties being retrofitted per new dwelling that's going to be constructed. Although Winchester previously had just a position statement, they've recently had a cabinet report which is proposing taking contributions of £3,500 per kilogram to go towards strategic mitigation, but the issue being that those sites haven't yet been identified. So, I mean, this really drives home the fact that any real solutions at the moment to this issue are very much developer-led, because local authorities have just not really been able to bring forwards a coherent strategy quickly enough. That might be a good opportunity, Connor, just to give a quick update of the position with regards to phosphates elsewhere and how that compares to nitrogen.
We have been working in other parts of the country where phosphates have been a particular issue. So in the Hereford area, phosphates are a problem in the River Lug catchment. And again, similar to the Solent area, that has put a halt on new development in that area unless you can demonstrate that your development is going to be phosphate neutral. Phosphates are particularly challenging because they're harder to treat, and the treatment requires sort of long-term planning and higher costs as well. And some of the mitigation measures, which we will touch on, require sort of a greater amount of land to achieve a similar benefit when it comes to phosphates. We're also dealing with developments in areas that don't currently have restrictions, but there are concerns by local planning authorities that this particular issue could come to their area quite soon. So, for example, Hereford city centre doesn't currently have any restrictions because it sits outside of the Lug catchment, but they are basically saying that if phosphate levels continue to increase in the River Wye catchment, which runs through Hereford, then this particular issue could come into play. So we're expecting to see this to start to appear and crop up in other parts of the country as we go forward. And it's not an isolated issue really to the Solent area. So it is something that you should be aware of, and it is something that you should be considering as part of your development strategy. Whilst you may not have to provide offsetting or mitigation at your particular development, it is something you need to consider. David, we can touch on the options then for mitigation, being direct or indirect. Perhaps you want to go through those?
Yeah, so in terms of Natural England's guidance, there's really two broad approaches to mitigation. So you've got direct effects, which is effectively reducing the nitrogen content in wastewater, which is the main source that we're really talking about from development. And that can be achieved either through upgrading sewage treatment works or providing interceptor wetlands, which will act to remove nitrogen from the foul discharge from wastewater treatment works. The challenges with that are that there's no real impetus at the moment in order to carry out those kind of upgrades, because there's inconsistency in how the governing bodies view the impact of wastewater discharge. Natural England are the principal body that we deal with for development and planning applications and appropriate assessment, and the Environment Agency are the body that are responsible for issuing permits for wastewater discharge. And because they have slightly different spheres of kind of control and responsibility, there's not necessarily a consistent approach to how this is looked at. So until there is a requirement to improve sewage treatment works and the discharge consent for nitrogen because of permit and regulation, there's no requirement for Southern Water to go ahead and do it. And actually there's no ability for them to do it because their funding is delivered by Ofwat, and that's a reaction to proposals which Southern Water will put forward to the various AMP periods. There's definitely nothing going to be done in the next 4-year period on the South Coast in terms of nitrogen. There may be the possibility for them to carry out a study to see what works might be possible. But having spoken to Southern Water, I mean, it's not a simple process for them. I mean, the largest treatment works in Eastleigh is Chickenhall, and I'm told by one of the operators there that it's not been designed for upgrades in terms of nitrogen treatment, and the only solution they will have will be to effectively bulldoze the site and redesign it from scratch if they need to tighten the nitrogen permit there. The other option is indirect, which is effectively what we've been talking about in terms of offsetting, which is reducing nitrogen outputs elsewhere in order to compensate for the increase from wastewater. So that could be, for example, removing or reducing nutrients leaving the development site, for example, in surface water through wetlands or reed beds, or potentially offsetting by reducing nitrogen loading elsewhere, like removing intensive agricultural land from active use and converting that to other less intensive habitats, for example, woodland, heathland, or grassland.
David, it's worth pointing out here that the amount of land required, from an agricultural perspective, if you have a low intensity agricultural use, i.e., grazing, trying to take that out to offset your development loading does require quite a considerable amount of land, which obviously poses a significant challenge then to develop, trying to identify that land, and B, negotiate the sort of purchase or change of use of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to throw some figures out there, I mean, the saving by converting 1 hectare of kind of grazing grassland to non-agricultural uses is approximately 8 kilograms of nitrogen per year, which, depending on the location of a development and what the treatment works is, that's probably going to offset somewhere between 5 and 10 dwellings. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of offsetting land which is required, and it's simply not a long-term practical solution. So in terms of challenges to mitigation, as mentioned, there's significant increased costs, potentially time delays to applications and development. There's issues with the inconsistent approach being adopted by local authorities. There may be a lot in the south coast, but there is a limit on the amount of agricultural land which is available for offsetting. It's because this deals with impacts on European sites, and one of the requirements of a habitats regulations assessment is that it must prove beyond reasonable scientific doubt that there will not be an adverse effect. The legal agreements required to secure mitigation do have to be particularly robust. And as I mentioned, there's inconsistency in the positions being taken by Natural England and the Environment Agency. As a result of this, we've got these significant technical challenges over the actual impacts themselves and the effectiveness of mitigation. Just to drill down some of the potential solutions in a little bit more detail, I mentioned briefly the approach being taken by Portsmouth City Council in terms of retrofitting existing housing. In principle, a very good solution, making use of their housing stock. Obviously, it's good because it doesn't require any additional land. The challenges with it are that they only have approximately 2.5 years supply of housing before all of their stock has been retrofitted. It's a very costly approach based on their original calculations, which were £4,345 per dwelling. However, they were suggesting that would be open to negotiation based on viability arguments and the like. And this is a solution that could work elsewhere, in particular with other housing associations, if they've got large amounts of housing stock, which is old enough that it could benefit from this kind of upgrade. And this is an approach which, in theory, would work equally well for areas where phosphates are the primary issue, because it's really creating capacity at the wastewater treatment works.
David, I would only add that this is, if you're bringing forward a new development, it's not really an option that would be available, in my view, because essentially most modern developments are going to have, built-in, efficiency measures into their design anyway, and it's getting tighter and tighter in terms of water usage per person. And I think trying to squeeze out further efficiencies in terms of water reduction use is going to be challenging.
Yeah, Natural England's assumption in their calculations, they use a value of 110 litres per day for wastewater usage, or water usage rather in general for new development. And they have historically been extremely reluctant to accept any lower figures on the basis that this impact is something we're considering over the long term, because the mitigation has to be considered in perpetuity. Their question is, how can you be sure that if we put in some water efficiency measures such that a development is going to use only 90 litres per day, for example, how can we be sure that that's still going to be effective in 50 years' time? And that's the kind of level of certainty they're looking for. So yeah, I'd agree with that, Connor. I think kind of squeezing that figure down any more is certainly a challenge. But creating capacity with older properties is definitely something which is an option. As I mentioned, there's a number of strategies and policies which assume the use of a gramping condition, but as I mentioned before, it's questionable from a legal perspective. It's also not a solution. It's a stopgap. There are potential uses where it might make sense. For example, sites where mitigation has been secured, or enough mitigation has been secured to allow partial completion, with a first solution coming further down the line, for example, it might allow sites to get started. There is a potential solution being delivered by, as I mentioned, by Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, which was being piloted in conjunction with Persimmon Homes, where they've acquired a large amount of agricultural land on the Isle of Wight. Their belief is that as the Wildlife Trust, they're able to secure land at a cheaper rate than individual developers or other bodies might be able to. Whether that's true or not, it kind of remains to be seen. But their costs are approximately £2,000 to £2,500 per credit, with each credit equaling 1 kilogram of nitrogen. The legal agreements are, I think, imminent between the Wildlife Trust and Fareham Borough Council and Havant Borough Council to enable that to be used as an offsetting solution for sites in those regions. There's also the potential that this site can deliver credits towards biodiversity net gain in the future, but that does add a lot of other complications, so that they're steering clear of that for the time being. The other type of solution, which is something that Connor and I have done quite a lot of work on, is using wetlands, which are much more efficient in terms of land use than simply taking land out of agricultural use. This effectively uses natural processes, so aquatic vegetation such as common reed taking up nitrogen from the water itself, and also providing a surface area for biofilms which carry out a similar process. So a typical constructed wetland could remove up to 30% of the nitrogen in the water that supplies it. So it's not necessarily a solution on its own, but it can provide a benefit to a development, and it's something that can be done alongside SUDs as well. So it is possible to design a SUD system so that it provides this function as well, and this works for nitrogen and phosphorus as well. So there's really two ways of doing it. One way is to have your wetland system online on site, where it's removing nitrogen and phosphorus from the surface water supply. And then the other option is having off-site wetlands where they can be located somewhere where the phosphate or nitrogen outputs are particularly high, for example, intensive agricultural land. And then that potentially provides a more efficient wetland system. And as I mentioned, it's much more efficient. For example, 1 hectare of wetland potentially can remove up to 3,500 to 4,000 kilograms of nitrogen if there's enough nitrogen in the water supply. The challenges with wetlands is that they have to be located in the right place, so suitable locations are limited, and also because it's quite a technical solution, there's a more involved process in terms of planning, design, and proving that it'd be effective than simply taking land out of agricultural use.
David, I would just add here that obviously we've been working with a number of clients who have recognised the opportunity in this as well. So whilst this is difficult for a developer and it's something they need to think about and plan for and seek further assistance on, we are seeing some landowners who are turning this into a real opportunity. So farmers that don't necessarily have development plans themselves, but are in a position to be able to introduce a wetland scheme on their own development and then sell that offset to potential developers. And obviously, in some cases, there's quite significant money involved. So if you do own a large land holding, there is the potential for you to be reviewing that portfolio, identifying areas that you don't plan to bring forward in the near future or could be used for the creation of wetlands if the conditions are suitable, as David has alluded to. And then that enables you to use that offset for other developments in that same catchment area.
As Connor alluded to previously, there's plenty of other areas on top of the Solent where this is kind of becoming an issue. Connor talks about the River Lug, which is shown on this plan here. Phosphorus is also a problem for the River Avon catchment, where there's currently a 5-year interim strategy, but on the assumption that the treatment plants will be upgraded, but that's still not 100% clear. There are currently issues in Kent, where Stodmarsh SAC is being impacted by elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels. West Sussex, where wastewater, they're outside of the push region, but they also have treatment works which discharge into the Solent. Hypothetically, any site where there is a European site which is sensitive to nitrogen, where there are also wastewater discharges, so for example, Medway Estuary and Marshes SPA and Benfleet and Southend Marshes SPA, which are on the banks of the River Thames, there is potential that this could be raised as an issue in those regions as well. For wetlands, we're looking at potential offsetting in the thousands of kilograms in terms of nitrogen, depending on the region, and in the hundreds of kilograms for phosphorus, which is a nutrient which is typically present in much lower quantities than nitrogen. So just in terms of how this is going to affect things going forwards, the problem's not going to go away. As mentioned, there's no plans for treatment works to be significantly upgraded during the next AMP period. We've been told previously that existing CJEU case law will remain part of our legislative framework once we formally leave the European Union, so we can't expect for those rulings to be revoked. We're finding that stakeholders are more and more asking for developments and mitigation to provide wider benefits, not just mitigating impacts. The hope is that local authorities and wider groups like Partnership for South Hampshire will get on top of this issue and provide much more coherent guidance and mitigation in the long term. But at the moment, it's a challenging issue that needs to be dealt with effectively on a case-by-case basis. And the way we're doing that is by adopting a multidisciplinary approach to providing offsetting required, so with input from hydrologists, Connor and his team, and an ecologist in my team who can carry out the habitats regulations assessment work, and also other disciplines who are able to carry out design work for wetlands and other mitigation solutions. Also planning consultants who are able to advise on kind of land options for offsetting, for example. We've been carrying out high-level screening assessments for developers and landowners to identify where high-risk sites potentially located, and also carrying out the actual detailed calculations and mitigation to assist with planning applications. And just to give one brief example, this is a site at Knoll in Hampshire, which we originally promoted through our planning team, which has a bespoke algae water treatment works, which was a particular challenge because it's not permitted the same way that southern water works are in the area for nitrogen. This development comes with a large area of open space as a benefit to the local parish, and we've been able to identify that land's got potential for offsetting, particularly the triangle of agricultural land you can see to the south of Knoll there. We're currently proposing to use that area to offset 4 other sites as well as the site itself, with the long-term management of the land being dealt with by Knoll Parish Council, and it's something that Winchester City Council are very keen on because any additional capacity that's left over might help them with the delivery of their wider solution. So I'm sorry we ran over a little bit there. I hope that's been useful and kind of provoked some interest.